Ron Koshoshek has been town chairman and a professor at UW Eau Claire, and probably maybe the most active citizen advocate for local towns in dealing with frac-sand mining issues across the region, and has met probably with more people than anyone else. And Ron's going to share some of his thoughts and experiences with us.
Way back in 2000, and incidentally, my background in this, I wasn't chair of a town board. That's why I'm still standing here alive today. I have been a plan commission chair in the town of Cleveland and in the town of Howard. And throughout my career at University of Wisconsin-Eau Claire, since the late 70s, I worked with and eventually served as the chair of the Public Intervenor Advisory Committee in the Department of Justice. And it was our job to protect public rights and natural resources of the state by overseeing state agencies, counties, and in some cases even towns if they failed in their public trust duties. So I've been involved in these sorts of activities for some 40 years. With all that experience, I had just moved to the town of Howard, been there, lived there a couple of years, and I was told there was going to be a mining proposal, a frac-sand mining proposal, that the Plan Commission was going to hear and review and make a recommendation regarding approval or disapproval to the town board. So I went to the meeting, and there were about 300 people in the meeting. Town hall was packed to the gills, and well, I'm a fisherman, I guess. I revealed my predilection for fish. The room was packed, and even outside. And what I saw there was astonishing and kind of symbolized the condition of town government that I found many towns in. The Plan Commission was illegally constituted, had no validity whatsoever. The town chairman was an ignorant, arrogant SOB who, when citizens would ask him questions, would simply reply, well, that's not important. People can do whatever they want on their property. That was the end of the discussion as far as he was concerned. And then they didn't make a motion to make a recommendation because I pointed out there was no plan for operation for the site. There was nothing for the public to review. The meeting was not properly noticed. It was an illegal meeting before an illegal commission. But I'm not dumping on the town of Howard. They're good people there. But they just didn't know what to do. So we ended up disbanding the Plan Commission. We got rid of the arrogant chairman. We reconstituted a new Plan Commission, and we drafted a detailed, comprehensive 23-page ordinance. And that just blew the town board's mind. Because the other part of that Plan Commission meeting contained a mining ordinance submitted to the town and approved of half a page. It was only one sentence longer than their ATV ordinance. Anything that's real long is alien. They don't understand it. It was too much too soon. But fortunately, the town board was willing to learn, go through the ordinance, paragraph by paragraph, line by line, explaining all of its features and why we have it in this way. As soon as we adopted that ordinance, the county, like the county did with Cooks Valley, declared the ordinance to be invalid because land use for them is zoning. Regulation of land use requires zoning powers, and that's not what the town had. Our town was an unzoned town. We thought we were just licensing, not imposing, but we used some unfortunate words, and that's what the circuit court judge the Canadian Sand and Pro, but after the county executive came out and condemned our ordinance as invalid, then the circuit court judge got it. A judge who, incidentally, before he took office, in private practice, we found out later, actually drafted the TIF district papers for the company who eventually occupied the land in the industrial park. You would think he would have recused himself, but that's part of the problem with all of this. There's conflict of interest all over the place among officials, among experts sometimes. So you have to be careful who your lawyer is and what the background of your experts are. That includes university experts who moonlight with consulting for the industry and trivialize citizens' concerns about silica dust and other things like that. Well, a lot has happened since that first ordinance, and ours was challenged. The citizens in Cooks Valley then were encouraged by our case and sued Cooks Valley, challenging the validity of their ordinance. And then we faced a very critical decision. Are we going to appeal or not? Well, when I was in the public intervener office in the Department of Justice as a public servant, it was not a paid position, we had a case called the Grand Chute Mall case. And we sued DNR because they should have required an environmental impact statement for that gigantic mall. Because in fact, we could show that an economic analysis would indicate it would end industrial development in the Apple Valley. That's a big deal when you build a mall like that outside of town, because of all of the gas fumes and everything that would end up in the air. They had, you have a certain allotment of pollution you could put in the air, and that would have exceeded the allotment. Well, it took us 2 years to get to the Supreme Court, and by that time the mall was built, and the whole issue was moot. In other words, there was no remedy for the problem. So what if you did it? What can you do about it? You can't tear the mall down. So I reminded our town board of the public intervener office's experience there, and I said, we can't afford to appeal. We're going to change our ordinance. We had in our ordinance a grandfathering clause. Oh, heck. They have grandfathering clauses in licensing ordinances. But the judge said there's a grandfathering clause. It must be zoning. We have the Plan Commission in our ordinance. Plan Commission has no authority. It only reviews and recommends. No authority to approve or disapprove. Oh, there's a Plan Commission. Where you see planning, you see zoning. Therefore, this is a zoning ordinance. And then we use the unfortunate word, which I never use anymore. We used permit. In fact, we used a conditional use phrase, right? Permit. The only thing I ever talk about was unzoned town now are licenses. It's like a curse word. I mean, it's gotten that way. It's a quirk that I probably have developed, but you don't want to talk about permits if you're unzoned. You want to talk about licensing. Anyway, so I've been going from the southern part of Wisconsin, St. Croix County, all the way up to Polk and Burnett County, talking to plan commissions. In fact, my friend back there from Stanton, I spent, remember, 3 nights, or 2 nights, 3 hours each night, helping Stanton get their act together as they were working on the zoning ordinance and making comments here or there. But that's what I've been doing for the last 1.5 years. And now that the shadow of uncertainty no longer obtains over the ability of towns to regulate frac-sand mining because of the Supreme Court decision that towns do have the authority to regulate mining through a licensing procedure if they're unzoned, or through conditional use permits if they're zoned. towns started adopting moratoria to develop ordinances. Now, I'd like to tell you, I said, I don't have much time, so I restricted myself because I'm an old man now and I wander, if I don't have some control over what I'm talking about. So I've limited myself to 9 specific points that I think, and I'm going to give you a kind of an overview of what issues our towns are considering and what solutions they're offering to some of these issues. Because it isn't a uniform thing. They're not like going on the internet, getting an ordinance and changing the name of their town with the name on the ordinance. They're not necessarily adopting the Howard Ordinance, which is a bit antiquated, even though we've updated it a little bit, and then putting in the town of Stanton. I mean, they're doing the grunt work themselves. The first issue that I find important for you to consider, and if you're a town board member to consider doing, and if you're not, what you have to get is baseline data. You have to have information about the area and about the sites with respect to the groundwater table, with respect to base flow in any private ponds or lakes or streams. Because if they go down unaccountably and you want to blame the company, unless you have that baseline data of how the world was before they acted on it, you won't be able to enforce it. You won't be able to show cause. These engineering plans, certainly and I'm speaking here because I was intimately involved with every single phase of the EOG permit license. These engineering plans occupy booklets, at least in EOG's case, that are a good 1.5 to 2 inches, 2 inches thick, full of maps and diagrams and so on and so forth. It's all armchair engineering. They never go to the site itself and get the data as to where the groundwater table is, what the gradient and direction of the groundwater flow is, what the composition of the bedrock sandstone that they are mining is. Does it contain lead? Does it contain arsenic? And in what concentrations? In Howard, we had to do that ourselves. We went into a private well, went down and sampled the water, and we found a significant amount of lead in the water before any pipes left the well. It was before the pump, below the pump. So we gave that to the county, who was at the time conducting the first reclamation plan for a Frac-Sand mine in the state, in this area anyway. And Dan Mastapole, the Chippewa County Land Conservation Department, which is really a great department as far as I'm concerned, with 2 full-time engineers with backgrounds in hydrology and water and stone geology. He wrote to Bruce Brown, the State Geological Survey, and Brown said, be sure you don't let them go below the water table. Keep them 5 feet above it. Because if you do and they start cracking up those rocks and releasing that lead, it'll probably leach into the groundwater and end up even more of it in the private wells. So because we did this baseline data stuff, we have a real good handle on what things could possibly be adverse effects. Also, what the company found out, EOG, is a mining company, drilling for oil and not so much gas anymore, but from oil in the Bakken Reserve and then a lot of oil drilling down in the Eagle Ford. And at the time, they purchased it from a Canadian company called Canadian Sand and Proppants, which has a site up in the town of Sumner where there's all kinds of issues and problems. They sold it to EOG, and they were going to be EOG's miner, right? They're going to mine it, and EOG would then build a plant and process it and head it out to the Bakken and Eagle Ford in Texas. They found that the water table level was 35 feet higher than the engineer who did the armchair engineering of the site said it was. He was looking at regional water table maps, highly inaccurate, not site-specific. What they did as a result of that, they lost. They were supposed to get, they expected to get 60 million ton out of there. Pardon me, 30 million ton out of there. As a result of this mistake in the engineering plans that were approved and permitted, they can only now get 12 to 15. A 50-year project shrunk down to a 20-year project. So you do need accurate data because you must insist on it in your ordinance. You must insist that they provide you with the depth before you even consider approval of the license, granting a license. Depth and gradient, very, very important. Number two, most towns, in fact, almost everyone, is distinguishing between sand and gravel mining and frac-sand mining. Part of that is that sand and gravel mining, and Glenn referred to a lot of the significant differences between them. They're not the same types of industries. Besides sand and gravel mining, we've lived with for many, many years, and it's seasonal. Its products are used locally, and they don't have defined patterns of travel and all of the rest. And they don't drive 80-ton trucks. So it's a different industry. Now they do this in 3 different ways. So there's not a uniform way of doing it. They do it sometimes with 5 acres or less, like size. Sand and gravel, 5 acres or less, anything over, frac-sand. They do it could also do it by tonnage. 250,000 tons a year is one of the criteria that they use. Anything, if you mine that much, you're going to be a frac-sand mine. And they also do it by geology. Bedrock sandstone mining is where frac-sand comes from. Sand and gravel come from a different type of geological strata, glacial outwashes and things like that. Number 3. One of the issues Glenn alluded to is how specific should the standards be? The traditional model of, you got 2 types of standards. You got best management practices, which is like dust control by putting water on the roads or wetting the sand piles, or noise reduction by using OSHA-approved sound warnings. That's one type. Another type is what we call performance standards. Now, this is kind of an issue because sand and gravel mining and conditional use permits generally only talk about best management practices. And as a result, they're unenforceable, virtually unenforceable. Here's what happens. You get a complaint which says, boy, I can't sleep at night because of all the noise. Well, we're using what everybody in the industry, best management practices is simply what everybody uses in the industry. We're doing what everybody else does. Oh, that person is just too sensitive, a little wacko. You can't, as one industry leader told me, you can't let one or two individuals stop progress. Performance standards are measurable. For example, instead of using as a best management practice like what is commonly done when you're backing up, you use beepers. Beepers actually travel a long way in terms of sound. Well, and that's a best management practice. You can't, OSHA approves of it, but we didn't want any of that stuff. We wanted performance standards. A performance standard is 60 decibels at the boundary of the site. Now, we should have said 60 decibels at the boundary of the site during daytime and 50 decibels at night. Because there's one place where the berm kind of goes down and disappears, and people can't sleep a mile away because they hear at night the banging of the gates of the waste material being brought back to get the sludge out of the back of the truck. And that we measured the decibel reading at the site, and it was 56. But this was an opening, right? It's a very quiet mine otherwise, but it's the opening. We measured that a mile away, and it was 54 decibels. Well, that's not a lot of difference, but see how it travels. Now, we are going to change our ordinance to 50 at night the next time we amend it. But now this is what's happened. Because we actually didn't have that in our first ordinance because we didn't want to push the envelope too far and be unreasonable, because there was this cloud of uncertainty that cast a shadow on everyone's work. But we got it into a developer's agreement. But we now amended our ordinance, and we do have a 60 decibel limit in there. Now that 60 decibel limit, its effect is to increase better performance. They don't use beepers at all in the mine site. They generate, every truck that's backing up has a digital signal transmitter, and every helmet, and MSHA and OSHA require all workers in mine sites to wear helmets. Every helmet has a receiver. And so the only people who ever hear anything, as far as beeping or warning sounds go, are people who have to wear the hat, who are actual workers. The site is very quiet. The only place that we have had complaints, is off-site, a mile away, where their berm doesn't dull the noise of the back of the trucks banging as they're dumping out the sludge. So I strongly recommend performance standards, measurable standards. When it comes to dust, just wetting the roads. How often you wet the roads, how much water, for how long, you watch how they dry out. That's an intensive inspection activity. The best thing to do is to monitor. Require the company to pay you to hire someone who's qualified as an air quality monitor and monitor what the dust effluents are from that site. Now, you need a performance standard to do that. You can't just monitor, because you have to kind of tell whether it's going well or poorly. So you're going to have to use EPA standards, because the state doesn't have any for respirable crystalline silica. But that's not hard. Any good air quality engineer knows how to apply EPA standards. You just hire somebody to do that. So that's another big issue. How do you want simply best management practices, which are unenforceable, and don't require and drive improvement in the operations? Or do you want what might be a little more technical, more exact, measurable performance standards? Some states even require for plants that are operating at night. They even have a numerical lumen standard. That is to say, how much light can trespass onto an adjacent property. We didn't put that in there as yet, but it's one of the things that we will strongly consider. I want to talk a little bit about property values. One of the things that I feel enabled us, well, let me put it this way, historically first. We wrote our ordinance, which we thought was a proper balance of the rights of the 11 residences that lived around the Howard Pit mine site. So we held hours of operation at 5 days a week, 10 hours a day. I mean, that gives the people, right? They're going to be bothered all day long in the summertime, but at least they'll have the evenings for peace and quiet. It was an effort to balance the interests of the mining company with the landowners. Well, that was unacceptable to EOG. 5 to 10 hours a day. Now, they wanted to operate 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And that's not a balance from our standpoint. But what's really interesting is that gave us leverage. We were able to say to EOG, well, if you want more hours, you got to give us something in exchange. You got to give us some protection that we're giving up by allowing you to do more hours of operation. And what they gave us was a property value guarantee agreement. Now, that for us was a great victory, but we got it because we had leverage. But also, I don't think it's the best you can do. One of the things that I want to emphasize to you is that this is a difficult process. I mean, even though I've been part of negotiations with huge mining companies on the environmental side, right, on the public intervener side, over the years, so that I had some exposure to the techniques and the tricks that people who have lots of money and who have a lot of experience negotiating have. I'm not real keen on agreements. Their town boards find it just difficult. Our town board did. I mean, I'd have to tell them, you got to be patient. They're not getting back to you because they want to put pressure on you to give in. I co-owned and co-managed a farm, my family farm, for 25 years. If we had problems with the neighbors, we just went over and talked over the back fence, and within a half an hour it was either resolved or it wasn't. But it happened in a hurry. This took 9 months to get this agreement. Originally, and another thing about these agreements, I don't know how you're doing it, and you might want to speak to this, Glenn, at Cooks Valley, but one of the problems was that you have to be able to be honest and open with the party with whom you're negotiating. If they can't trust you and you trust them, it's going to break down. And I think, we had our town lawyer, very experienced in these sorts of things from Madison, who was a special counsel on mining for us. And they had their lawyer. One of the lawyers who lost in the Supreme Court case, which was a moment of considerable joy for me. But those two lawyers never got anywhere. I mean, our lawyer had to come back and talk to the town board. Their lawyer had to talk to people in Fort Worth, Texas, and back and forth, and then here's a sample of a property value guarantee. Holy cripes, it was a 6-page sample we got for their lawyer with umpteen zilling, averaging out multiple appraisals, and it's just, I think it could have been done in a page and a half, which in fact it is. So the CEO of EOG said, let's get rid of the lawyers. Can we negotiate directly with you? And the town chairman says, yeah, I'll bring Ron along and we'll do that. So that went on, and we finished the whole agreement in 5 sessions of 4 hours without lunch, which I thought, well, whatever. Anyway, so it is difficult. Now, here's what I'm proposing, and in fact, it has been adopted by Crawford County as a way of guaranteeing property values. We're using a setback requirement. Now, mind you, Crawford County is an unzoned county. I didn't think any of those existed until I went down there and started at their invitation to talk with them. An unzoned county. There are only 2 towns in the county that have town zoning. So what Crawford County is doing is developing an ordinance for the towns, which the towns then will adopt. It's detailed and comprehensive, and they'll all have the same thing. This ordinance contains a setback requirement of 1/8 of a mile. Now, it's not, the 1/4 mile, or it's 660 feet from the boundary of the property, plus it has a setback of 50 feet on the property boundary on which you can place a berm, and the berm had to be at least 10 yards from a ditch, unless the parties consent to a closer distance, okay? So you have essentially a ban on mining if it's within 660 feet of a residence, unless the residents consent to it. Now, that makes the idea of consent have some market value, right? The individual property, we've discovered that individual property owners don't want to move. They don't give a damn about this fair market value guarantee because it's their home place, their folks live there. That's oftentimes happens out in the country. Or in one case, this is a beautiful rose gardens. It takes 15 years to establish those things. Well, whatever, a long time. And they don't want to leave them. They don't want to start all over. They're 60 years old. They don't want to start all over somewhere else. So the individual landowner that lives within that setback can say, okay, I'll allow you to mine on that property because I live 660 feet closer, slightly closer, or maybe 300, I don't know. But you have to give me a stipend every year. You have to pay my taxes every year. And then I'll consent to it. But giving the consent has monetary value. Now, I'm not going to argue for the 660 feet. This is pretty innovative stuff from what's happening. It's different than negotiating in agreements by the town board. But it seems to me that it's very appropriate to do it in this way. Maybe you want a quarter mile. You got to be reasonable, though, because if you push it too hard, just for the sole purposes of not having any mining in the town at all, the legislature is going to get really, really nervous, and we're going to end up like we've always ended up, not being able to control what goes on in our towns. I mean, that's happened with landfills, that's happened with confined big farms, that's happened with wind turbine farms. That's happened a lot every time the legislature took away town authority. We don't want that to happen here. So we're trying to develop a relatively uniform but highly effective state of regulation. 6. We only got 4 more to go. Water quality issues. DNR is the only interest in water quality that DNR has is in sediment contained in stormwater runoff. They're not interested in water, in chemicals that may be added to the water. They're not interested in the other qualities of water, just stormwater runoff, erosion control. That's all they're interested in. Because their stormwater program is a consequence of a construction permit. Also, DNR does nothing to protect private wells. Nothing. And your counties, most of them don't have non-metallic mining ordinances. They just administer NR 135. So they have no protection for you there either. So that's something very critical. Make sure that the quantity as well as the quality of your private wells in adjacent residences, we have it up to a half a mile. Once you find out what the gradient of the water table is, you can't look at the surface. Surface water runs southeast on the Howard mine. Groundwater runs southwest. It's part of the Red Cedar watershed, not part of the Elk Creek or Chippewa River watershed. So, if the private well goes dry, you need procedures and remedies for that. Make sure that your ordinance, and this is something all of the towns are doing, has thorough cost recovery provisions. Recovering the cost for expertise used in reviewing the application, granting the license, inspections by experts in case their complaints have to be investigated, monitoring for dust, enforcement for violations, and even the cost of creating the ordinance itself. We are also, and this is my last word or subject, we are also confronted with a lot of PR. I don't like to demonize corporations. But they're in the business of persuading you to let them do something. And they will use numerous devices, PR tricks, that will try to get you to do that. They will trivialize your concerns for dust, for example. Oh, what we produce is whole grain sand, like whole grain oats, healthy. So beware of that. There's a major movement afoot. The companies have formed a lobbying group in the Michael Best firm in Madison. And they're going to be busy at the legislature trying to see if they can get rid of town government regulations. And they'll use all of the historic arguments, over-regulations, and so forth. And they claim they want to be good neighbors. And then you have to, that was EOG's claim, and that was very effective. I was so happy they said they wanted to be a good neighbor, because then we started I defined for them what good was. And most of them have Christianity backgrounds. And you know what the definition of being a good neighbor is in the Bible. It's love thy neighbor as thyself. So if you're going to do something that will diminish the value of your residence by $100,000, and you wouldn't do that to yourself, why would you do that with your neighbor? But behind that kind of, and I just kept hammering at that theme. You want to be a good neighbor? Well, then be good, or give me another definition that's useful. And that was very persuasive. But behind that, of course, is always the bottom line. You know, we emphasize how much, and our Kurt, coincidentally, was a student of mine at one time when he was at Eau Claire. Kurt was saying that, you know, we've seen estimates of the plant being $65 million. And EOG has told me that it costs them to take 1 ton of sand from Chippewa Falls down to Texas in the Eagle Ford, $120 per ton. That's what it costs them. Okay? Now, because they don't sell the sand to other people, they use it themselves. And because of that, the latest estimate is about $200 a ton for sand in the oil fields. Well, do the math. They fill 50 cars a day. 18,000, 100 ton a car. I mean, just do the math. They have paid for that $65 million plant in 3 months. So emphasizing all the costs as a reason for, you know, being light on them, not having them guarantee fair property value or, right, minimize the injury yet you would be willing to inflict on your neighbor, but not yourself. That rings pretty hollow when you start looking at the finances. Okay, thanks.
We could go on forever. We promised to be done by 10 o'clock, so it leaves us 25 minutes for questions. So I'm going to give this to you, Glenn. Do people have questions?
I get a real simple one. I went to the hearing in Menominee on Tuesday, and R.J. Sykes of Vista Sand said he is going to pay the royalties, do the mining, process the sand, and deliver it to Texas for $27 a ton. EOG ought to cut a deal with him.
Was that a question, Jerry?
Yeah. How does he do it?
Well, it's really unreliable. If you get it from a source that you don't know whether to believe them or not. I do believe my source.
I think that I was there too, I think what he meant, Jerry, was $25. He said our total cost, landlord royalties, land, hauling, getting on a rail car, costs us $25 a ton to get on a rail car. I don't believe he was talking about transport to Texas.
Those of us that weren't on the panel couldn't hear the bulk of his presentation. He spoke away from us.
That's what he was talking about. That's not inconsistent, though, with what you were saying about 120 by the time you get the rail.
Yeah, I have several questions relating to, one of them, we've had several 200-year storms in the last 10 years or so. So expect some more. Is it permitted in these ordinances to limit the gradient that they can mine on? in some manner? I mean, obviously we'd be using some kind of expert to give the gradient pitch and all that, but can you put a limit, or has anybody done that?
I don't know of anybody that has done that, but I do know this, that there are surprises that are occurring that not even the companies themselves did not expect. For example, in the Howard mine, they go down to the floor 5 feet above the water table, and then from then on, it's blasting off a cliff and it shearing straight up and down. So the gradients are about the same as they were before, where the land hasn't been unmined. However, even when there isn't rain, we are getting periodic releases of floodwater that is coming out of the mine. And the reason we're getting all those periodic releases is because there's so much seepage that is coming in through crevices and through the bedrock itself, getting to the floor of the mine, and they pump that out from the base of the mine because they got to operate down there. And pretty soon the stormwater pond gets full and they have to release it so it doesn't blow out when some actual rain event comes.
Yeah, let me just take a stab at that too. I think, and I have the benefit of having been able to think about your question while Ron was answering it. I think that under a town licensing ordinance, the town can regulate almost anything as long as it has a reasonable basis for that. And if regulating the gradient would be to protect the water quality or the groundwater, or to prevent dust from blowing, I see no reason why you couldn't regulate that. But you need to have as Ron was saying, you need to have a basis for that. You can't just pull it out of the air and say, we're not going to let you go on a certain percentage slope. You have to have some good rationale for that.
It seems to be the key to the thing is the reasonable part.
Yes.
Yeah, putting stuff in that has to be reasonable, and otherwise it's open.
And that's why you see so many differences in the ordinances right now, is because, 4 years ago, we could look at things and we could say, well, this makes sense and that makes sense, but now we're learning about this whole process, and we're learning about it in the context of Wisconsin geology. And so, the ordinances that are developed in the future are going to be better than the ones in the past, just because of that experience.
One of my other questions was about, I've seen in some of my research, I've seen some towns that have tried to put a per ton fee on the sand that's being hauled, but I've also heard that is not legal because it's the same as a tax. I'm a little unclear on exactly what they're talking about, but.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I haven't seen a Wisconsin ordinance that does that. Maybe there are some, but I think some states might allow that. Wisconsin, I think you'd run into the uniformity clause under the state constitution if you try to do that. And I would not advise a town to do that. Now, but having said that, you can protect your town roads through escrow accounts, through bonding, through letters of credit and so on. There are ways to make sure that the town and the people in the town are protected with revenue and with money from the mining company for the impacts. But I don't think you can just put a tax on, per ton.
Right. Also, another question, like you were talking about how when it was sent through the circuit court and the ordinance was kicked out, whatever you want to call it, that these three companies came in. Have there ever been a case where just parts of the ordinance has been sued, or is it usually the whole ordinance?
Oh, good question. What you're talking about is what's typically referred to as a severability clause in an ordinance. If an ordinance is drafted to have that kind of a clause, then a court can look at it and take it apart and find that certain parts of it are severable from the rest if they're, for whatever reason, illegal in the court's judgment, and keep the rest of the ordinance in place. If an ordinance does not have that kind of a clause, and part of it is invalid for whatever reasons legally, then the whole ordinance goes out. So, one of the things that anybody should be doing in an ordinance that has any detail in it, if it doesn't have a lot of detail, if it's like the Cooks Valley ordinance, which is a very simple ordinance, and that's been upheld, you don't really have that fear. But if you start putting a lot of detail in it, as far as standards in the ordinance that haven't yet been challenged on their face, then you should have a severability clause.
Okay, I think that answers the question I had on that. And the policing of the town's ordinances, I think I know the answer to this one, but I just wanted to get your take on it. The policing has to be done by the township itself, of the township's ordinances?
Yes.
You can't rely on another agency to,
No, not unless you have some kind of a cooperative agreement with your county to have the sheriff, that's a way, you could theoretically draft an ordinance that would be
but
done
essentially
with the
it's up
county.
to the township to police
I mean,
its own
what
ordinance.
I found interesting was Ron's comment about, was it Crawford County?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, if you had a uniform system within the county, but adopted by the towns in conjunction with the county, I could imagine a situation where
Yeah,
the county could
The
actually
county
have
will
enforcement.
enforce, the
Yeah.
county's, that arrangement is
right.
that the
Yeah, I
county will
understand
enforce the ordinance for the towns.
Yeah.
Okay. There was another thing about there's a lot of mines that they seem to get a lot of land, 100 acres say, but they only mine 20 acres of it, but they might strip the whole 100. Is there obviously, would it be reasonable to require them to only strip a certain amount within a certain time frame, or is that something that would probably be challenged?
That falls under how it is to be reclaimed, which falls under NR 135
okay.
and under the county authority. That is not something you have. In fact, you can't really control too much of what goes on the site itself. Your control is off-site impacts, and your control is very indirect. For example, a sentinel well. Chippewa County put in sentinel well requirements when they initially tried to administer 135 for the Howard mine. DNR came down on them like a ton of bricks, saying you cannot regulate water. You can't require sentinel mines. Now, what Chippewa County has done is gotten them to voluntarily install sentinel mines. But you could require a sentinel mine in the down gradient and test it more frequently than they have to test private wells. In our arrangement, we have sentinel wells in place because Chippewa County required them. But we would insist on that, and we do require sampling of all wells down gradient every 3 years.
No, that makes sense, I see.
Yeah, let me just add, on your point too about how much they're mining at any one time, typically a mining company will get a reclamation permit under NR 135 and a county ordinance, and they may get a permit that allows mining on 100 acres, let's say, or 80 acres, or whatever amount, but they're going to mine only part of that at a time, and then usually they're going to backfill and start to reclaim as they go. That's typically how surface mining is done.
Oh, I see, okay. Thank you, I believe that's all I had. Thank you very much.
Glenn,
Thanks.
could I ask you a question that
Yeah.
I don't know the answer to? I'm very eager to hear what you think it is, or might be. One of the problems that I'm seeing all around Wisconsin is things are being permitted in one jurisdiction or municipality or county, and then having negative impacts right across the border on a municipality. And that happens a lot. I mean, not only in the St. Croix, Glenwood City area, but that's happening down in Waupaca County. It's, I can't recall, but that happens a lot. Then there's also the federal jurisdiction over railroads, and then how about impact off of these transloading facilities that are being put on railroad property and so forth. Now, when I was writing the comprehensive plan for our town, there's a chapter in there on intergovernmental cooperation, and that's a big deal requirement. We had to give our comp plans, to each other, all neighboring adjacent towns. And the idea there is that when the towns act, they have to take into account how the other towns have planned their community. What happens here? I mean, there's got to be something.
Well, it's interesting that this has come up tonight. I've been working on a case, a First Amendment case involving a noise ordinance, believe it or not, and I've been going through federal case law, and there was a case in Illinois where there were two municipalities right next to each other, and they were trying to regulate noise from a great big amphitheater, and they had to work together to do it. And honestly, that's the only way that I can see this, being done under current law. We don't have regional government in Wisconsin. We have counties, we have towns, we have the state, and then we have villages and cities, and these cross-border differences in regulation and conflicts are a problem, and the only way that they can really be worked out is through the intergovernmental cooperation that you're talking about, Ron, where, if you've got just as an example, talking during the break about the village here, if you've got mines outside the village and they're trucking coming through, maybe the best thing to do is to try to convene some kind of cooperative, some kind of meeting to get some cooperation and get the state involved, if the state highway is involved too, to regulate the truck traffic and the noise and whatever other off-site impacts might be caused by mines outside that are then falling on people inside the village. But that requires some really proactive government, local government, along with state and county government. And I hate to say it in this day and age, I don't see a lot of that going on.
When you first started talking about the early stages in your township in Cooks Valley, you were talking about, if I understood you right, you first said, well, we thought about zoning, and then we thought, well, the county is never going to let us do this. And so you kind of went the ordinance route. So I just got two questions, really. So the first question is, what's your viewpoint in terms of the optimum control by the citizens of the land use, specifically this sort of land use, in terms of zoning versus an ordinance? If you have the full range of options, what would be the option that you would choose? And maybe the answer is both, and what does that really mean? And then the second question is, Glenn, you talked about the magic words of safety, health, and general welfare and all that, which I don't know if that's actually defined any further than that in the statute, but I'm assuming that's a qualitative, those are qualitative terms in many ways. And so as a practical matter, when these sorts of mines are proposed in townships, what really happens is that the people in a half of a township or a third of a township will say, oh no, we don't want that there. We don't want all this truck traffic here. Everybody will be able to see it. It's an awful idea. Let's just say no. We don't want to grant them a rezone, or we don't want to grant them a license. So what really happens in terms of that? The township's ability to say to an applicant, we don't really want this. We think it's degrading to our quality of life, and we say no. What's the fine line there? So the general welfare question, and then and also the zoning vis-a-vis ordinance.
Well, let me take a stab at answering it. I hope I can do it, because I think your question encompasses many different aspects of this whole area. From my personal perspective, I think in an ideal world, well-planned zoning would be preferable to a more general licensing ordinance that is specific to non-metallic mining or any other kind of regulated activity. The reason I say that is because you get the community involved in a planning process, which many communities have already been involved in the state under the smart growth law. And you look at your community, and you look at your you know, your all the attributes of your community, your infrastructure and so on, your natural resources, and you decide where you want to have industrial uses as opposed to residential uses, as opposed to agricultural uses, and so on. And then you lay that out. And then anybody coming in and wanting to develop something can see, okay, you know, if they want to do it, they have to rezone it, and then there are standards that apply and planning that governs that. That's in an ideal world. We're not in an ideal world. The problem is most communities already have zoning, or they don't. And if they do have zoning, it's premised on a whole lot of assumptions that are now out the window with this new industry coming in. And that happened with large-scale farms a few years ago. It happened with wind farms. Ron mentioned this. It's happened with landfills. Every time you have a new, very different type of land use that causes nuisance problems, you upset the status quo in a community, and you challenge, in effect, the ability to regulate and to deal with it under zoning. That's why Cooks Valley looked at this. Cooks Valley had made a decision years ago not to get into county zoning. You know, many people in that town, just like many people in rural America all over the place, were of the view that people ought to be able to do what they want to do with their own land. And I say this when I speak a lot of times. I think I forgot to say it earlier, but if you take a survey of people and you ask them, should you be able to do with your land what you want to do, almost everybody raises their hand and says yes. And then if you ask them, should your neighbor be able to do whatever they want to do with their own land, almost everybody raises their hand and says yes. Or no, I mean, sorry. So you have this inherent conflict in people's view of property rights. The licensing approach is the only way we could deal with that in Cooks Valley. We could not get zoning in place through the county board that would regulate frac-sand mining the way the town wanted to. Now, what the town wanted to do is to be able to just say no. And the town, I believe, could do that. A town can do that now with an ordinance like Cooks Valley's or Howard's or many of these others, can look at it and say, no, this kind of operation is too risky to the groundwater, the air, people's health, people's property values, people's quality of life. It's simply unreasonable to put a frac-sand mine in this location or that location. You know, as long as they go through the process and find that. Or the town could say, well, it's feasible, but only under certain conditions. And we're going to put those conditions on, and those are the kinds of standards that Ron was talking about and that I've been talking about. And then the third option is to say, well, they just need to buy everybody out. And that's kind of, we're kind of at that point with these agreements and licenses or permits that have standards, but then also have a buyout provision or have a property value guarantee. So it's a complicated answer to a big question.
Well, Ron, would you-
Yeah.
I don't think I really have anything significant to add to what Glenn had to say on that point. I prefer, I mean, in the real world, Chippewa County is worthless. I mean, as a county government, it would be better if it didn't even exist. I mean, it's awful. And so we never wanted to be county zoned. That wasn't even an option. When I wrote the comprehensive plan, the questionnaire, I explained what zoning was because I didn't want to get tied up into all of this baloney about it. And then would ask them questions. 81% of the respondents said, yeah, they want town zoning. Not 2% said they wanted county zoning. We had zoning, actually, we had zoning for about a month until the anti-zoning people came out of the woodwork and the the property rights folks began saying, well, if you won't be able to paint your house white without a $35 permit, and they just scared the bejesus out of everybody. So we lost in that referendum, that vote that we received at the annual meeting of the town board was rescinded then. And so then we were left with. But I think sometimes, even, if you get the right setbacks, I think you can come pretty close to achieving what, in a licensing ordinance, what you might be able to achieve, certainly what you'd be able to achieve under county zoning these days.
But just to follow up to your point, when you said that a township could say no based on its unusable site, townships, I think, also have a fear that they're going to go to these little rural townships, and there's this big company from Texas, and they can't just say no because the big company will just sue their pants off and roll over.
But always keep in mind that that's why you bought town insurance. If your town board is sued, the taxpayers don't pay for it, your insurance company does. And you've been paying you've been paying $5,000 a year and probably never even used it, many of these towns.
I can tell you that I think, okay, okay. The question was, or to summarize the point, I guess, is aren't towns concerned that they're going to simply be sued if they try to just say no to one of these operations? Well, that's what happened in Cooks Valley. The folks who sued the town of Cooks Valley also sued. It was the same firm behind. It was Will Riley. It put the bug in the ear of the county administrator in Chippewa County, and wrote the phony letter that said you can't do this, and that became the basis then for the lawsuit, and the judge, who Ron referred to, bought it hook, line, and sinker. Some of us knew that it was BS all along, and we knew who was behind it. But this is the way, you have to play this game. The problem is that here we are, now we've got an ordinance that's been upheld. Towns clearly have this authority. The question is, how far can you go with it before you poke the skunk and get sued? Again, over certain terms or conditions that you put into a permit. Nobody's gone that far yet. If we go that far, and I think Ron's point about setbacks is a good one, but I can tell you my experience with setbacks in representing people in the wind energy area, where I've ticked off a lot of my environmental friends over the years because I've stood up for landowners and towns that want to regulate large-scale wind energy. What happened is we were so successful in doing that with licensing ordinances that the industry went to the legislature and got the law changed and took away the authority of towns to regulate based on setbacks. What we do have in that situation, and what we're using actually now in Cooks Valley, is we have noise restrictions that are actually pretty strong, and they're based on World Health Organization standards. So you can regulate these things to protect people's health, which includes being able to sleep at night when you have noise, lights. You can regulate truck traffic. You can regulate a lot of things under public health, safety, and general welfare. If the legislature takes that away, shame on them. That's a complete sellout to the industry, but it could happen. But I'm of the school where, and some lawyers disagree with me on this, they're afraid to regulate because they're afraid that if they use the authority, it'll be taken away. Well, think about that. That's pretty circular logic. What's the point of having the authority if you're not going to use it in the first place? If you're not going to push the envelope and protect your own residents, property owners in a town, and risk having it be taken away because you're doing the right thing, then what's the point of having the authority in the first place?
But in law, there's a word that's called the weasel word. And the weasel word in law is reasonable. If you want to have an argument, just introduce the word reasonable, and people are going to be arguing about what's reasonable. And that's where you get this kind of a vacillation about how far you should go. I mean, how far is reasonable in this area? And so you make these kind of judgments without any, you don't really know how far. But at some point, it just seems to a lot of people unfair, too much. You're trying to ban mining through the back door rather than, being upfront and doing it with a reasonable standard. But there's no clear answer to what that is, and that's oftentimes what goes into court is this, be reasonable, and people say, that's not reasonable, and then they argue about it.
Ultimately, too, one of the problems with this whole process is that you have people very divided within communities. This, like other NIMBY, not in my backyard types of things, tends to divide people, and this one is dividing people along economic lines. People who are now getting, contracts or leases to sell sand and are all of a sudden getting rich, they don't really necessarily have a lot of concern about the impacts on the community. Their neighbors who are not in that situation do. That's important because ultimately the town board is in a position, or in some cases the county board or county zoning committee or board of adjustment, to try to sort this out and regulate. I will say this, in regulating, Ron's right, the word reasonable is always a word in the law that can be tricky. But two things are important. One, try to get a majority of people behind what you're doing. And that means don't do it in private, closed meetings. Be transparent and get public support for what you're doing, but also do your homework. And if you're going to put restrictions on, try to have some factual basis. When we talk about reasonable, what we really mean in the law is a legitimate reason. It's not arbitrary. It's not pulled out of the air. So, it's not based on an assumption. It's not based on a belief. It's based on some kind of factual underpinning. So if you can do that, whether it's be noise, light, setbacks, or just saying, as an example in Cooks Valley, we've already got 3 mines. If somebody else wants to come in now and mine, our town chair has asked me, do we have to permit another mine? I said, well, no, we didn't have to permit any of them in the first place, except that the court struck down our ordinance. Now that we've got it, we don't have to permit any mines, but we're in an even better position now to turn down new mines because our infrastructure can't handle all the traffic, all the trucks, all the dust, all the noise. At some point, a court is going to look at that and say, yes, Cooks Valley has a valid, reason for turning this down. It can't handle it. So you have to look at these things that way, I think.
I was out there for 9 months out in North Dakota. I lived in a town called Dodge. I had about 400 and some people in there. We had a gas station. That was our hangout. Mostly the concern that I had was with the truck traffic. Not only that, but I hauled the sand, what they're talking about. It gets in your nose. It can create nosebleeds. It's all health hazards. It can provide cancer. That is, you can shake your head, but I've been there. I've done my research. It is a fact. I've had nosebleeds. I've never had nosebleeds before I hauled that stuff. After I hauled that stuff, I had nosebleeds. So, the other concern is with so much truck traffic, the state patrol could not keep up with the ordinances of pulling and keeping the truck in safety hazards. Also, you talked about, sir, you said that you went to a 7-day, 24-hour, that's what they wanted, whatever. My question is, if it does go that way, how is that legally possible if over-the-road guys like myself can only work 70 hours in a week? You're talking 84 hours 1 week. Whether it's local or not, there's still regulations on how many hours a person can work. 84 hours is double. 30 hours 34 hours over your 50-hour rule per truck, that's a lot. There's no place to put these trucks. Not every truck is going to get put back at the mines or wherever. So you only have one truck stop at Quick Trip. Where are all these trucks going to park, and what are you going to do if they break down? That's my question.
Okay, it's just about done.
I don't think that anybody can really give a good answer on that because of the fact that we don't know for sure and how many mines are exactly going to be here. And this will all be later coming down the path as the next few months go on. And at this time, I want to say a very special thanks to these guys and give them a nice round of applause. I think they've everything that I could have asked for tonight as far as explaining these things without sand mine people being here and local government people all coming to this meeting tonight. I'm really, really happy, and I think it was a very good success. And once again, I want to thank these guys just tremendously because I think they did an outstanding job. And Pilar, if you're here, a special applause for Pilar because she's the one that really put this thing together, and she really did a good job. And I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for coming, and I want to wish you all a very safe trip home. Thank you.